US President Donald Trump flip-flops when it comes to tariffs, and he's picking fights with leaders all around the world. So is this the action of an erratic leader, or is there a clear strategy behind this? That is the question that is puzzling geopolitical strategists. What motivates Trump's foreign policy, and what does he ultimately want to achieve? Well, to help us understand that, we have Dr. Piet Croukamp, a political analyst and lecturer at the Johannesburg University in South Africa, in the studio with us. Hi, Pete. Welcome to NSN.
Hello, and thanks a lot for having me.
Well, can you give us some insights on the motivations of Donald Trump? Are these actions solely driven by sort of erratic egotism, or are there underlying factors influencing his behavior?
Look, I'm not a psychologist, so I wouldn't want to analyze his personality, but I think most people will describe it as narcissist, egoistic, unpredictable. But I don't want to go there because I think
Mm-mm.
there's a bigger picture too. And I think that perhaps those of us who thought of the liberal democratic model that was called it the Western political regime, that there was sufficient or significant consensus in that system about the underlying values, and that those values had to do with tolerance and liberty and the free media, independent institutions of governance. But underlying was a sort of a consensus, a normative disposition, expectation of the role of the state, the role of society, and the degree of tolerance for the variation that exists in Europe. There are significant variation between Germany and France, and between Germany and Spain, and Germany and Portugal and France. It's not exactly the same model, but there was a degree of tolerance for the broader regime of a liberal democratic system. And one assumed, for many decades, we assumed that the American system is compliant with that. Well, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we've made a mistake because maybe we forgot to think about the American political system as a highly militarized one, as a highly individualist one, as a one that lacks call it the systemic empathy towards other societies unless it's interest driven. So if you look at US aid, for instance, we always thought that it's twofold. The one is that is one way of establishing a footprint for a liberal democratic state, to establish a footprint in areas, in jurisdictions where it doesn't necessarily have a presence or a military base or the influence that it would wish to have. So it's almost as if you, by doing good things, you establish a pattern or a footprint, and that creates a type of perception about who you are, your willingness to think in terms of exporting the ideals of democracy to other societies and giving them the opportunity to buy into it. And US aid was first of all, it was meant to establish that footprint, and secondly, one assumed that because it's only 1% of the American GDP, it's a very, very small part of the US economy, but it gave America a massive footprint, a massive presence in large parts of the world. And one would think that it was also altruism, a form of altruism, a form of goodwill that was spread by rich countries to poor countries in the world. And now with this suddenly, when together with Musk and Trump and Vance, when they suddenly cut this thing, impromptu, one has to ask yourself the question, is it altruism or was it only interest? And I think Donald Trump sees the world as, what interest do we have in a particular system or a particular relationship? And if we don't, we must sever that relationship. If it's not beneficial to us, we must stop that relationship. If we pay more than anybody else or somebody else to be part of that relationship, we must suspend that relationship, even if we do it arbitrarily, if we do it unilaterally. And in that sense, what America is now is that suddenly it ends up with friends that used to be foes and with foes that used to be friends. And it's a confusing world we live in. And we tend to think, but is it Donald Trump? Like the question that you've asked, is it Donald Trump? Is it his personality? Are all these other politicians, Rubio and Vance and Kennedy, are they all buying into this strong personality? It's very, very possible. It's very possible that he has such a dominating presence with so much power that they will comply with his regime preferences or his underlying normative values about the greater good and what is bad. It's quite possible, but I think one has to look at the system as well, and maybe the political culture in America. And if we described it as a militarized political culture, then I think there's a lot more that is being explained than just saying it's a madman doing mad things in irrational ways.
What about the US economy and the fact that the US is being challenged as a superpower by China? What influence do you think that has on Trump's strategies?
Look, it looks like his primary enemy is still China, and it looks like um, uh, the massive trade deficit that America has with Europe, but more so with China. That is what's disturbing his inner being. That's the one thing he would like to change. I am not 100% sure that he thinks that it's a communist state, and therefore, because he has, you remember that he invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago, and he liked to have a relationship with strong individuals. He went to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He loves Putin, ostensibly, and he's got a good relationship with Xi Jinping, or they had a good relationship. So strongman, he's got an affinity for strongmen. I think what is disturbing him about China is, first of all, is that if you look at power parity, purchase power parity, then the Chinese economy is now bigger than the American economy. And they really moving in a direction which they could be in 10 or 15 years, be a stronger economy. Their value and supply chains is more competitive now than the American ones. That's why they produce more consumer goods and they want to export, and they do export that to the US. It means that the value and supply chains in China is more efficient. And when Trump, by tariffs, prevented the Chinese to get the benefit of access to the American economy, the Chinese just went via Mexico and they entered the American market again. So I think that that's the one thing that disturbs him, the efficiency of their value and supply chains. But there's another thing that disturbs him, and that is the technology that comes out of China, their ability to compete as far as tech is concerned with China. And you remember that in his first term, he used tariffs to control China or to impact China's value supply chains. And then came Joe Biden. Joe Biden didn't really do that. He maintained the tariffs. But what he did is he suddenly put a brake on the access that the Chinese had to superconductors. And that was a massive impact, had a massive impact on China. And you'll remember when the Chinese president saw Blinken, or he saw Biden, or whoever he saw, the very first thing on the agenda was, what about the superconductors? What about chips? Why is it that we have this this firewall, this prevention of having access to technology? And the thing about superconductors is by and large designed in America and is manufactured and duplicated in Taiwan. That's one of the reasons why it doesn't really make sense for them to take over Taiwan to get access to these chips, because you just remove them because they are designed in America. And that's the other advantage that America has had until now. But I think there's a feeling, a threatening feeling with with Donald Trump, that the Chinese sooner or later they will design their own chips. It might be taken another 10 to 15 years because it's a type of institutional memory that's been designed and embedded in a very particular techno hub. You can't just design it. It takes years to develop that system, that infrastructure to design superconductors. But these things that eventually they will get there, and they feel threatened, I think, the Americans, specifically Donald Trump, by the fact that, first of all, militarily, they cannot afford a war with China anymore. Technologically, the Chinese are catching up, and the economy, if you look at purchase power parity, then already it's a bigger economy than the American economy. So that is their real threat. And I think that determines at least part of his behavior. Russia is no technological threat. It's no economic threat, nothing. It's not even the 11th biggest economy in the world. But as a package, China represents something that becomes a real threat to the idea of how Americans and Trump views power and the monopoly in power that they used to have for 80 years.
Well, because of these fear, if you challenge the dollar, you're also going to have problems with Trump, as BRICS is doing.
Yeah, but that's a manufactured fear. 80% of all transactions in the world are you use the dollar. There is no currency that competes with the dollar. And the big thing about a currency is that if you want to be a currency, if you want to be a universal currency, trust is the most basic attribute, characteristic of a universal currency. There is not a single currency in the world that can compete with the dollar when it comes to trust in the currency as a means of payment. So I think that's a fabricated fear. This idea that the currency will develop and evolve from China or in the BRICS countries. Those countries don't trade much with each other, and they all have a massive trade deficit with China almost. So I think that's a manufactured fear.
So, what are your thoughts on the implications of this direction that Trump is going into for ongoing conflicts like in Ukraine, or what impact would it have on Europe and African countries like South Africa?
He might just have some success in Ukraine. Sometimes political power, raw political power, give you access to the political behavior of warmongers throughout the world. They respond sometimes to power. So he might just be successful when it comes to what is happening in Ukraine. He is obviously, I think, alienated himself from Europe. I don't think they will trust him ever again, and there will always be a lingering mistrust about America in the future. Because just remember what Donald Trump is doing. If you look at the statistics, the surveys, it doesn't look like Americans disagree really with him what he's doing. He maintains his support that he got in the election, which means there's sufficient and significant support for what he's doing. And that tells the Europeans about the political culture that prevails in America. That tells them something about the future. So my answer is that the Europeans prepare them for being on their own in the future. Well, they're a collective, but they can be on their own. But also that America might side with the enemies of Europe. For instance, it looks like it might change now. But a week or two ago, if America has withdrawn their intelligence from Ukraine, they have withdrawn the satellite technology from Ukraine, and they went into a deal which removes sanctions from the Russians. By implication, it means that Europe was indirectly at war with the Americans. Somebody that was just 3 weeks ago was their closest ally. So that type of unpredictability, and what they will do is they make an assessment, what are the roots of this? And they will find that there's a political culture prevailing in America which you cannot trust. It's very, very different from how the Europeans view the world, themselves, political relationship, and geopolitics.
Well, we've said often that Trump is transactional, and it's, in the Ukraine war, he wants minerals in exchange for a security deal or for him as the peacemaker. So, how should Africa view this? Because recently the DRC has also offered minerals in view of a security deal with the US.
Now, if we approach them and it is beneficial to them, but they don't care about Africa. I think I've read a British historian, he said the other day that Ukraine is just not important to America. It's a complexity they don't need in their lives. Well, if they can get access to the type of minerals which will give them an advantage vis-a-vis China, they might be interested. But once that deal is being done, they don't really care. It's not as if they have some affinity to save Ukraine from the Russian interference or Russian expansionism. It's whatever's in the Americans for it. If there's nothing in it, then they wouldn't care about Ukraine. And so if we talk about transactional, well, remember, transactional behavior emanates from the idea of the individual is the most important unit of analysis. And in America, individualism is more important than anywhere else, and certainly more important than it is in Europe as well. So the Europeans will think it's not only Trump that's transactional, it is the political cultural disposition of the average American that's transactional.
So, and Africa, do you say it doesn't care about Africa?
They don't care about us. They haven't visited us in the past. It's not interested in coming here anytime soon. We're just not important for as far as American interest is concerned. And he will, you know, Deborah Petta. I spoke to her. She just returned from Sudan the other day, and she said that on the morning when they decided to stop U.S. aid abruptly, on that morning there were long queues of people, thousands of people standing there. Suddenly there were no food, no medicine, and not even somebody to serve them, because the people that worked there were told to go home and not to come back. And the people who were standing in the queues were told to go home and not to come back. In other words, people don't have the expectation to get food tomorrow, to get medicine tomorrow. And if the mother is HIV/AIDS positive and that baby doesn't get the medicine, the baby will also be HIV/AIDS positive. It was a massive human catastrophe. And he just couldn't care less. Rubio couldn't care less. He couldn't care less. Musk couldn't care less. It is that transactional individualism that it depends on our own political interests. I might be wrong, but I think it was one of the American presidents, I can't remember who it could be, who said America the relationship is about interest. That's what's important. If we don't have a particular interest, we don't want to pay for it anymore. And America don't want to pay for the protection of Europe. It's not only the protection of Europe. What they say is we're not willing to pay for the protection of liberal democracies, of free society, free and open democracies. We will rather go into some sort of arbitrary relationship with authoritarian people than paying for the maintenance of a liberal democracy somewhere in Europe.
Dr. Piet Croukamp, thanks so much.
Thank you. Lovely to see you. Thanks. Bye-bye.